My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kalima Hurra on Almayadeen television. Mind you, I don't mince my words. I speak Kalima Hurra, and my audience does too. Kalima Hurra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to Kalima Hurra with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing Iraq. I became so close to Iraq that when I heard someone use the word, I turned as if they had called my name. Iraq entered my bloodstream and it will never leave it. For many years after the invasion and occupation of the country, I literally dreamt of the country and my many times there, which was odd really, because in 1990 it was practically the only Arab country I had never visited, and if I had, I would have been arrested as a known and vocal opponent of the political regime there, when we used to demonstrate against the regime of Saddam Hussein in Tottenham Court Road in London. Outside the Iraqi Cultural Centre, the police used to arrest us. They called us communist troublemakers because we were demanding what they later claimed they invaded in order to impose, namely democracy and independence for the people of Iraq. The reality is I have lost touch with Iraqi politics. I don't know who's who or what's what. So the distinguished panel of experts I have with me this evening will be teaching me as well as you. But this much I know. The United States still occupies Iraq. They have military bases there, even though the Iraqi parliament long ago told them to clear out. This much I know. The United States is in Iraq, first to pacify Iraq in its own interests, and second, to cause problems for the Islamic Republic of Iran. This much I know. The rest I'm looking forward to learn. Iraq was broken by the George Bush and Tony Blair invasion and occupation. I made a very long stand against that process, and I paid a price, just not nearly the price that was paid by the people of Iraq. I, along with millions of others of British people, marched, protested, did everything we could inside and outside of Parliament to hold the line against the barbaric aggression of the so-called civilized world. In my case, I had, for a decade before that, been leading the protests against the quieter massacre of 500,000 Iraqi children. You'll remember those children, the ones whose deaths Madeleine Albright, who now resides in hell, said was a price worth paying. Well, I had been in Iraq. I had seen the little coffins being laid in the ground. I had smelt and sensed the terrible toll that the Western sanctions were taking on Iraq. I fell in love with the country. I miss the Tigris and the Euphrates. I shall probably never go there again, but I am here with people tonight who know the country just as well as me, and in some cases even better. So let me press on. I'm just the enthusiastic amateur, as always. I'm joined by distinguished experts like Dr. Mohammed Arif, with whom I spent time in Iraq, and with whom I haven't spent time for 20 years. So this is a very happy reunion. Dr. Mohammed Arif is the former General Secretary of the Afro-Asian Solidarity Organization. He's an expert in economics. He's an anti-imperialist campaigner. He lectured on the rise of China as long ago as 2008 and met President Kim Il-sung of North Korea. in 1990. I'd like to talk to you about that latter point, but not for now because we have so much to discuss. My summary of events in Iraq, do you share it or not?
100%. 100%.
So go ahead. Where do you see Iraq now? Who is benefiting from the instability in Iraq?
Well, that's a very interesting question because as you very rightly explained, that first 10 years, 13 years, Iraq was subject to sanctions, but sanctions were not against the elite. It was against the ordinary people of Iraq, defenseless people of Iraq. And as a result, as you rightly said, 500,000 children died, and uncountable virtually men and women perished because they could not get medicine, they could not get food, they could not get other amenities. So it was really a punishment for the ordinary people of Iraq, not the elite. Elite lived comfortably, in fact. Then they imposed a war on Iraq in 2003, which was sold on the platform of deception, that they have weapons of mass destruction, when there were no weapons of mass destruction. The whole purpose of that war was to grab the oil resources of Iraq. And that was confirmed not only by one person, but several persons. I mean, General Abbas of Central Command, he said that the war is about oil. And Greenspan, chairman of
the Federal Reserve,
he openly said, in his book actually, he says that the war was precisely to grab Iraqi oil resources. So
well, as Donald Rumsfeld said, it's not our fault that God put America's oil under other people's countries.
Exactly. But interesting book, which Antonio Hajaz, if I rightly remember, in her book, the Tyranny of War and Bush Agenda. In that, she says that the whole purpose was to grab Iraq's oil resources. And then, having grabbed the resources, what they did, in a year's time after occupation, they imposed a constitution on that country. And that constitution was sectarian constitution. Problem with that constitution is, once you impose that constitution, a sectarian constitution, then every group of people try to grab resources and power, and they never really come together. And you replace what is called national identity by sectarian identity, and that is a recipe for conflict. Although America introduced it, but they took it from the British textbook. They had done it in many, many countries, this kind of constitutions, you know. And since then, Iraq has faced constant instability.
Divide and rule.
Divide and rule.
We ruled the Indian subcontinent with 60,000
Sri Lanka,
soldiers.
many countries, in fact.
Yeah.
If I go one bit more.
One last point.
One point, which I will expand on later on.
Of course.
The beneficiary of this is actually Western powers. They have the control over the oil, and there is geopolitical interest as well to destabilize Syria and to destabilize Iran if they can, you know. Because it links to Lebanon as well, the whole area, you see. So there are geopolitical objectives as well as economics.
For sure. Now, Syed Mohsin Abbas is a well-known guest of ours on Kalimahara. He's a journalist, political analyst, and activist. He's currently working as an independent documentary television producer and a political commentator. Syed Mohsin, how does Iraq today look to you? Who do you think benefits from the current instability?
Well, adding to what the doctor said, I think the beneficiaries are quite clearly also Israel. The beneficiaries would be Daesh. The beneficiaries would be Turkey, which is part of the NATO alliance. So there are several beneficiaries of instability in Iraq. which we could analyze in more detail. I mean, how Israel? Well, Israel has a well-known Odin-Yinon plan, and Iraq is very much part of that, the destabilization, the domination.
And a physical presence in the Kurdish area.
Absolutely. And I think they've made the Kurdish area actually where their main base is. And it's one of the cards they're also using in Iraq to create ethnic division. So it's not just the religious Sunni-Shia division. They've also, right from the beginning, had an agenda to try and create differences between Arab and between Kurd and the various other, tribes, etc. So to be fair, the American invasion of Iraq, time and time again, has been primarily to dominate geostrategically that region. I mean, they've got about, I think, $4 billion of exports, largely oil, that are coming to America. But then if you think about China, which has got the Belt and Road Initiative, they've got something like an $8 billion trade income. So Americans aren't totally in there for money. That geostrategic necessity imposed partly by Israel's interest and partly by their own, because they're hell-bent on making the Islamic Republic of Iran a target for regime change and for color revolutions. Then they need Iraq as a base to do that. And what they've done is they've gone in without any intention of really building the infrastructure of Iraq once they've invaded, or even when they got rid of Saddam or afterwards. They had no intention of getting rid of Daesh either, because the reality on the ground, I had a very detailed article in The Cradle, which was written recently, which documented in great detail the way the Americans conveniently allowed ISIS to come into sort of Mosul. They saw the
columns going across the desert.
Just that tells
you a mouse in the desert.
Exactly. And they did nothing with all their sophisticated intelligence. Then you could catalogue all sorts of other incidents where they picked and chose when they wanted to hit Iraq. When they wanted to destroy ISIS, once they'd failed in their mission in Iraq, they basically torched Raqqa. You saw how the whole kind of place was devastated. Why not earlier? So Hillary Clinton is on record, Donald Trump is on record, virtually admitting American support for Daesh. So this was another thing which is still looming, a looming problem for the Iraqis. Had it not been for Qasem Soleimani and the Iranian support and the Ayatollah Sistani's fatwa to launch the popular mobilization units, you would have seen today Iraq with the black flags of ISIS absolutely dominated by essentially what is a proxy of America. So that gives you an idea. Turkey can't be left out of the equation because they're playing the game with Kurdistan in the north as well. And this is why Iraq partly just cannot find instability, apart from the corruption and the finances which the Americans pump into certain sectors of Iraqi communities to make sure that there's no real democracy and governance becomes impossible and corruption is rife.
Dr. Ali Hussaini knows best of all because he is an Iraqi. He is an academic and political analyst. He opposed the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein since the early 1970s. He was probably outside the cultural centre in Tottenham Court Road with me. He was condemned to death in absentia by Iraq. But he now, of course, has an interest, as we all do, in stability in Iraq. Dr. Ali, welcome to the show. What do you think of what you've heard so far?
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation, George. And also, I have to pay tribute to your long-standing support to the Iraqi suffering. And I remember when you used to join us at the Tottenham Court Road and also Trafalgar Square when we lifted the banner for putting Saddam Hussein on trial for his genocide crime.
Funny how it all goes around, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. And when the Iraqi nation was waking up to the fact that they were being misused over the 30 years of dictatorship and bloodshed, in addition to the sanctions my brother Dr. Arif commented to, the Americans felt that they got to take control and topple Saddam Hussein, who was their ally for years and who fought Iran on their behalf for 8 years, to take control and under the pretext of weapons of mass destruction to go into Iraq after really depleting that country from all the talents, on all the natural resources. And as my friends here said, they just really came in with slogan of democracy, which is really divisive democracy and disabling democracy rather than real constitutional regime change and allowing the talents of the Iraqi people to work out and replace the remnants of the dictatorship by constitutional law-abiding government. And they have selectively chosen those who are corruptible and nothing to do with the national interests of Iraq as a nation of 7,000 years, as a cradle of civilizations with all the talents in starting jurisprudence, scientific development, and in trying to create a stable Iraq. Even to date, when the elections happen, there is so much manipulation, and even when they want to form their government, there is behind the scenes play through various politicians in the north and the south or in the western part of Iraq, so that they don't come to any agreement. Like, for example, the Kurdish brothers in the north of Iraq and Kurdistan to decide on a president so that the democratic process starts working, so that they can appoint a prime minister or other constitutions. They have been stopped from doing that under pretext that conflict between the two main parties, while even the Kurdish people on the streets of north of Iraq or Kurdistan are suffering from all the deprivation you can think of. The same thing applied to the middle and the south of Iraq, and also for the western part of Iraq, they implanted some self-interested, corrupt politicians who are just really interested in money grabbing and allowing the Americans to play whatever they want in the fields of the country, looking away from the oil revenues, the trace elements avenues, the water avenues of the country to be utilized for this benefit of the Iraqi nation.
We've talked a lot about America. We should hear from an American. Dr. Kevin Barrett is in Wisconsin, USA. He's an author, a journalist, a radio host, a PhD in Islamic studies, in studies in Arabic, and is a well-known Fox News debater. Dr. Barrett, who benefits from the instability in Iraq?
Iraq was one of the most developed Arab nations and one of the most implacably hostile to Israel and insistent on its own independence and sovereignty. Iraq was using its oil revenues for its own people, for building infrastructure, and it was contributing to the Palestinian resistance. And for that reason, Saddam Hussein, who had originally been handpicked by the CIA, in fact, his first job was as an assassin for the CIA, he ended up becoming a little too independent. And as so often happens with the US empire, as Kissinger said, it's dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but to be a friend is often fatal. So the destruction of Iraq has perhaps benefited the US empire to a certain degree, although all of the instability and the rise of the axis of resistance has countered that. But I think the biggest beneficiary of the destruction of Iraq and the other nations in the region is the state of Israel.
Do you think that the US or the West in general actually have any interest in seeing a stable Iraq?
The US is not interested in peace, especially these days. In the past, the US sometimes would try to create a stable regime by overthrowing a legitimate government that wouldn't cooperate and then installing a brutal dictator who would impose stability so that the US could extract the resources of the country. But now we have the destabilization doctrine, where the US empire maintains itself by systematically destroying countries. And what that does is it prevents those countries from becoming prosperous and strong and sovereign and independent and able to pursue their own policies. And that's why we still have a world where, with a few exceptions, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, most other countries are, to one extent or another, still under US influence. And the US has military bases in well over 100 countries. There are 800 U.S. military bases around the world, and the U.S. empire is still there in part because it's been able to prevent other nations from becoming strong enough to shake off those shackles and pursue their own course.
Do you think that the recent clashes in Iraq, probably masked by U.S. hand behind the scenes?
I think the U.S. is still systematically destabilizing Iraq. The U.S. used ISIS or Daesh as an instrument of destabilization of both Iraq and Syria. And of course, they're using it in Afghanistan today, where it's entirely synthetic. Daesh in Afghanistan is just a U.S. cat's paw. But that was largely true in Iraq and Syria as well. And so now in Iraq, we're actually seeing a different kind of destabilization, where the forces around Muqtada Sadr are being, I think, perhaps instrumentalized by the same kinds of people who used Daesh in the past. Now, of course, there's no real comparison between those groups. Muqtada Sadr in many ways is an Iraqi hero, but the U.S. does not want Iraq to succeed.
The U.S. has got its hands full, you know, in Ukraine, in Taiwan, and of course 3 decades in Afghanistan, which led to their rout in the middle of the night, stealing away like thieves in the night. How many places, because I could mention many more, how many places is the United States going to meddle?
I think the U.S. is a dying empire that is lashing out dangerously in its death throes. The U.S. empire went from taking over the world in World War II, and we should note that World War II was not just a U.S. war against Germany that then became a U.S. war on Russia in the aftermath of the defeat of Germany, but it was also a U.S. war against the UK. The U.S. defeated the United Kingdom. That was actually the single biggest conflict, the most important conflict of World War II, pitted the United States against the United Kingdom for running the world's biggest empire. And the U.S. won that conflict without firing a shot at the UK. Roosevelt very cleverly planned to steal all of Britain's gold supplies and did so with aplomb. And that's why after World War II, that empire transferred seamlessly from the UK to the US. We should never forget that, especially you over in the UK. So with that kind of historical perspective, we should keep in mind that the US empire it went from being dominant but still challenged by the communist world through the Cold War to being a self-styled unipolar hegemon thereafter. Now that era of unipolar hegemony is ending as the West loses its huge edge in resources and technological power and economics. The West still controlled something like 60% of global GDP not very long ago, well into my lifetime. And now it's down towards, 40%, 30%. It's going down all the time. And the US share is declining even more precipitously. After World War II, the US had some ridiculous chunk of the global GDP. I forget if it was half or something like that. And it's heading down sort of towards something like, 15%, I think. By 2050, the West will be fully eclipsed. And so this notion that you can maintain a Western empire overseen from Washington, it may have worked up until about now, but now we're kind of going off the cliff. And so the US is doing what dominant nations have done in the past. When their empire is threatened, they tend to wage preemptive wars to try to sustain it. The number one power typically wages a preemptive war against the number two power, and it tries to enlist the help of the number 3 or 4 power in doing so. The US right now is stupidly not only trying to stop the rise of the number 2 power, China, but also antagonizing, and that's an understatement, the number 3 power, at least military speaking, number 3 military power, Russia, the only nation on earth that really can challenge the US militarily because it has a nuclear deterrent that can stand up to the US's nuclear forces. So the US is basically fighting everybody at the same time: Russia, China, Iran, and anybody else. Imran Khan, when he stands up for an independent Pakistan, Venezuela, Cuba, the US is going after everybody at once, which is really bad strategy. But I guess they're rolling the dice because they feel that they have no choice. That is, the writing's on the wall. The empire is doomed unless something really cataclysmic happens. And I fear that the neocons would rather embrace cataclysm than a post-US unipolar world.
Dr. Barrett, not your average American. Much more on this subject after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen television, coming from London, talking about Iraq. Dr. Ali, are we not in danger here of denying Iraqis themselves agency in this instability? Dr. Barrett was the only one who named names, so let me underline the name he named. It's Iraqis that are invading the presidential house and the parliament building and fighting against other Iraqis. Are we not in danger of infantilizing the Iraqi people by blaming it all on the big bad wolf, the United States?
A good question. I think Dr. Barrett cleverly indicated on some of the tactics which sometimes make you win a war without shooting a bullet.
Yeah.
And that's what they call like the zero wars nowadays, when you try to manipulate people's minds and brains to the extent that even they fight each other within the family, within a sector or within a nation, thinking that they are fighting for their interests while they're actually fighting against their interests. And unfortunately, that's what's been happening in Iraq when there is so much manipulation, pushing some of the inadequate leaders, giving them like a popular image to influence the masses under various pretexts, whether the religion, sectarianism, or nationalistic slogans. And the people gradually realize that, but sometimes when they realize that, it might be too late for them. And that's where the role of the learned people and the experienced, honest, educated people can come in and help the nation. Otherwise, they can just go on a self-destructing course and they lose even their interest and their country. And that is happening all over the history. And as Dr. Barrett was saying, happened in last century, even against Britain, when there was conflict between USA and United Kingdom, and they managed how to manipulate.
We're still occupied. I'm always waiting for the American forces to break through the door of this studio. Let's go over to Greece, to Sean Mathews, a journalist, a reporter for Middle East Eye, usually based in New York, but on a news trip to Greece. Sean, you recently wrote that as the Iraqi crisis deepens, the American influence dwindles. Why do you say that?
What we have seen in general is a decrease of interest in Iraq, and that is manifest in a way just through the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. Embassy staff in Iraq is operating on a skeleton crew right now, since COVID began. So, what we're seeing in the U.S. is a limited ability to influence the situation in Iraq, and limited willingness. But I will say this, George, I mean, it's not just the US, it's Iran as well. It's Iran, it's the US, foreign actors who are involved in Iraq. What we see from the political crisis today is that it is actors on the ground, Iraqi actors, who are driving events, and not the US or Iran for that matter.
The subject of this show is who gains from the instability in Iraq. If Iran is as involved in the United States, as you seem to contend, what benefit would Iran get from an unstable Iraq?
I think Iran loses out, just as much from the chaos, George. I mean, the U.S. has always been afraid of Shia on Shia conflict in Iraq, as has Iran. I mean, Iran has always tried to keep the Shia house in Iraq together. That's been a key goal of Tehran. no, I don't think anybody wins from the current crisis, particularly the Iraqi people, because their country is unable to, fix their economy, to fix the issues that matter to young Iraqis. So a question of who wins, it's really a question of who is losing. And that really means everybody. I don't see the US gaining any ground. I don't see the Iranians gaining any ground. They're probably even more concerned about internal Shia rivalry. And of course, the Iraqi people are losing out because the very serious economic crisis that young Iraqis face, in which they mobilized for just years ago, that's been pushed to the sidelines. So what we're seeing are political actors on both sides in Iraq who are trying to gain and gain leverage through the crisis.
So if there's no benefit for either the US or Iran, why is it happening? And who is benefiting from it?
I think we're seeing at the end of the day, George, what we're seeing is that the situation in Iraq, the government in Iraq has not been able to deliver for the Iraqi people on both sides. And no matter who it is, the average Iraqi on the street has seen their quality of life disintegrate since the US invasion in 2003. So the situation is a manifestation of the internal consistencies in Iraq and the corruption, the nepotism, the inability for young people to get jobs, the inability for any social mobility. In some ways, it shows that Iraq is ungovernable as it is as a state today.
What about the US military bases in Iraq, which the Iraqi parliament ordered them to evacuate a long time ago? Will they be evacuated in the way that the bases in Afghanistan had to be evacuated?
I don't see the US evacuating the bases in Iraq currently, especially because of the blowback in Afghanistan that occurred with the US withdrawal. And to be clear, the Biden administration, they have not even put that on the table. I think the US is focused on, the mission to train and defeat ISIS, and those bases they see as necessary. So I don't see any US bases closing in Iraq.
Let me be blunt. Does the United States consider Muqtada al-Sadr as a potential ally for them, not just in keeping their presence in Iraq, but also in putting further pressure on Iran?
I think there are some in the US who viewed Sadr as a nationalist. And if you speak to former US officials or US officials US officials and former US officials, they will say that what they would like to see in Iraq is a candidate who is for Iraq, not for outside actors. Sadr has billed himself as a nationalist, of course, and there are some who viewed him as a hedge against Iran, of course. With that said, I don't believe the current situation is an example of U.S. influence to try and lift Sadr up. I think U.S. is scared just as much as Iran in Shia on Shia conflict in Iraq. Nobody wants to see that. That's not something the U.S. wants to see because they know that any violence in Iraq could further extremism, and that the campaign to defeat ISIS, which is a real priority for Washington, would be hamstrung by that.
Well, look, Syed Mohsin, a lot of that was very contentious and controversial. But he did have a point that this is Shia-Shia infighting. This is Sadr declaring himself as the Iraqi Shiite leader and defining others as pan-Shiite leaders, as interested in what happens in Iran and in Syria and Lebanon as it is in Iraq. It's a kind of Sadr isolationism, isn't that right?
Well, I think Sadr has certainly, taken advantage of that vacuum. There was definitely a vacuum for somebody standing up and saying Iraq for Iraqis. And I think that is something...
Iraq first, like Donald Trump. He's the kind of Iraqi Donald Trump.
Yeah, so for political purposes, to create a position which would attract a kind of an audience or a backing, I think he's been very clever in the way he positioned himself there, and he did occupy it very successfully in the last elections. But I mean, what we've also seen is actually there's far more at play. Muqtada Sadr, whatever he says, in reality, it only took one resignation of Marja'iyat by the successor to his great relative, Syed Bakr Sadr, to actually rock Muqtada Sadr into even resigning from politics. So you can see how quickly these things can change. And what the Iranians have quite cleverly, I think, done in the background is they've also gone to the legal infrastructure of Iraq and they've put a stopper on essentially what he'd done in the parliament, which was to dominate it with this new narrative. And what we're seeing now is an impasse in which the legal fraternity have the veto, essentially, of what Parliament wants to do in the future. The elections will very likely happen. I think if it continues as it is, I think that we're going to see actually the backlash, and the Iranians and those people who are part of, I guess, a resistance axis perspective in Iraq, because Iraqis aren't outside of what the Middle East regional power plays are all about. They know perfectly well that the Saudis are on one side, they know the Iranians are on the other. So it's not just the Americans and, of course, Israel. I think that the Iranians have far too much to lose to allow Iraq to drift into complete control of Americans. They felt the force of that when Saddam was around with the first Gulf War, which people often forget, the Saddam invasion backed by the West and other powers to invade Iran. Million soldiers lost their lives on both sides on that. I think that trauma will make sure that Iran really tries to see that Iraq is in the hands of those people who are friendly to it. That's only natural for a neighbor. Whatever the Americans do, I think they'll face very strong political and other opposition from that front.
Dr. Arif, how bad can this get? Is it a real possibility that this conflict, this internal Shia conflict, can become a civil war? If it did, what would the other actors in Iraq do?
There are other actors. And I think the game is much larger than just internal conflict. In fact, Iran and China has signed 25 years agreement of cooperation, which has a military component as well in it. So, and Iran's influence is in Iraq. So one objective of Western powers is somehow to reduce or expel Iranian influence in Iraq, you see. And to that extent, I think the conflict will intensify. But Americans are not going directly now. They are using their proxy. And the one proxy which they are using now is French president. He has visited Iraq twice. He has signed pact of Total, their oil company, will invest something $10 billion. And they have also signed an agreement, are about to sign an agreement, to build a metro in Baghdad. He has also gone to Sunni area as well as to Kurdistan. The Americans are using proxy, French as proxy, to have influence in that region, and through that to reduce Chinese influence. You say Chinese, there are Chinese companies and Russian companies, but their share of total oil production is very small, in fact. The main production is carried out by American companies, Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, all these companies are producing enormous amount of oil, and they are producing at a concessional rate. Most of the contract given to them were given on in secret, really. They're not transparent apparently, and not by bidding. So they are making enormous profits. So if I take the issue that in spite of enormous wealth of Iraq, people in Iraq are extremely poor, and 35% of young people are without jobs in that country, you see. Now, somebody is benefiting from it. The recent...
So who are these proxies? We should
French are
name names. We should...
at the moment, French are being used as proxy.
Yeah, but it takes two to tango. Who's dancing with Macron?
The current prime minister is quite happy to have French influence there, you know. So you can see the Americans are not going directly because they are discredited. British are not going either because they are discredited. Public will not accept them. So best way for them is to send someone else.
Is that how you see it, Dr. Ali?
I think that there is some mix-up. It's like they've gone through stages, like the nest of peas and then the nest of spies, the nest of ISIS. Now, because of the economic and energy and food crisis, they are pushing the nest of mercenaries, local or European, to try and just milk the wealth of that country while they are feeding some like civil problems in various parts of the country. Shia against Shia, Sunni against Sunni, and Kurds against Kurds. but mainly because the Kurdistan situation is being monitored and controlled a long time before the invasion. They are like being used as the safe base for people to move into the other parts of Iraq. And as you said, this could be part of the reasons why they are not keen to follow the results of the recent elections and form a proper Iraqi government, which will respect the law of order, the law of order, the constitution, and allow proper government officials to do their jobs. So all these contracts you're talking about are just really being done under the table, and suddenly you hear that $500,000 gone to the pocket of Mr. So-and-so, and you go through his history, and he was just really a simple worker in one of the oil factories, on one of the ice factories, without even background of education, but they're just gone through the channels where they could please the Americans or their allies, and or the Israelis' interest in the region to promote themselves. And
But
they're
this,
quite happy to stay like that without
this
any
American
supervision.
journalist he was talking a bit in code, but he was placing some considerable part of the responsibility for this on Iran. You think that is true?
Well, Iran, as they announced a lot of time, that the security and stability of Iraq is important for the national security and stability of Iran, because of the long relationships with the cultural, religious, or geopolitical. But at the same time, the Iranians are playing a clever game now, letting the Americans to play freely, and the people realizing what's happening without obvious American influence, about from the looking after the PMO people, because they have served the Iraqi nation at large. They managed to liberate Iraq from a second invasion by ISIS, which almost would have gone. And also if ISIS, which has been supported by the Americans and Europeans by their own admissions, even Biden admitted that years before he became a president, that suggests that they wanted Iraq to become like a pariah state and make use of the natural resources without anybody thinking about them. But the fact that ISIS was defeated, that also served the peace of the world. And that takes me to the point that Dr. Barrett raised, which he suggested in disguise, that it's about time the Americans' aspiration stop playing stupid and just really realize to do mature politics for the region, because the instability of Iraq, Afghanistan, they have already paid the price, Lebanon, Yemen, and so on, is really detrimental to the not only the American interest, but the world economics, the food crisis now, the energy crisis. Now they've got this Ukrainian crisis on their hands, and they don't know what to do.
It is a potentially disastrous situation on top of the instability in Afghanistan, the instability in Pakistan that Dr. Arif referred to, and is, I think, being underestimated. If, God forbid, if anything were to happen to Imran Khan, Pakistan would explode, a nuclear-armed country of 350 million. Instability in Iraq is just about the last thing the world needs.
Well, I think that we can't deny that there is some kind of a reset going on in the world. The fact is there's too many things happening consecutively to go into denial. And the international powers, as well as the corporate powers, all have vested interests in this. Let's not forget that the people who really benefited from the Iraq war were largely the corporate war machine that exists out there. You know, everybody from Lockheed Martin, they were the ones who profited from these wars. And again, with instability in Iraq, with the oil that we've already now analyzed and seen who's actually profiting from it, you can see it's big business, it's big corporations, which are actually also very much involved in this business. And I think that in this transition, or this kind of devolvement of power from perhaps the West to China, which seems to be increasingly what seems to be happening, there are going to be casualties. There are going to be winners and losers. Iraq is right at the hub of all of this kind of, if you like, power play and this geopolitics, unavoidable for it to be. So the pipelines that are going north, going west, they all run through this region. The oil that exists there and its kind of regional significance is so profound that actually until the Iraqi people who unfortunately, you know, democracy takes time. People need to be educated politically. Political literacy takes time. Iraq's just not even had a chance since Saddam and the war upon war that's been imposed on it. To expect the Iraqi people to have the political literacy to fight back against all the psychological operations, all the color revolution propaganda, all the machinations which Israel and America primarily have triggered, and then of course there is a reaction from the opposition to all that. The Iraqis are in the middle of all this. It's hard to see how they would be able to resist all these forces, but we can only pray. Ultimately, there is a bigger planner up there in the sky, and one can only hope that he intervenes to create a situation where all of the people who've got ill intention towards Iraq and generally for exploiting the world and oppressing the poor people are foiled in their efforts. That's
God willing. My own experience, I have to tell you, is that the Iraqis are the best of the Arabs. And if the Iraqis cannot see what's happening and the way through, it's unlikely that the Arab world as a whole will do so. I just wanted to make the point, as I made it at the Oxford Union rather famously, with many tens of millions of views now. The Iraqis were teaching algebra when we were painting our faces blue and living in the forest. Dr. Arif, as my oldest friend, the last word is for you. Is Iraq going to get through this? Or are we in for another Afghanistan in Iraq?
I'm pessimistic about it, partly because Americans and the Western powers are not going to let Iraq go free, because they have the location of Iraq is such that one side it is connected to Iran, other side connected to Syria and Lebanon. So the whole belt really, if it falls out of Western control, then they will lose the whole area. So they will do everything possible within Iraq to make it unstable and therefore keep their influence. There are certain factions which are pro-Americans, in fact. No doubt about them. They will probably give strength to them and probably using France now to support them. In fact, France already said that they will supply arms to Iraq. That goes to show that there is some nod from somewhere for French to do these things, you know. So I'm pessimistic unless Iraqis get out of this sectarian conflict. Remember, sectarian conflict, once it starts, is not between Shia and Sunnis. It becomes within Shias and within Sunnis. There's no end to it. It further fragments various groups, you see. And that's what is happening in Iraq today.
Iraq, I love you. I beg you not to descend further into the pit of civil conflict and to resolve the differences that are your business and not mine between you in a peaceful and fraternal way. Remember that you are Iraqis. It's something to be, you know, an Iraqi. Let's not tarnish the name of the great Iraq.
There will be a hope.
So,
Inshallah. Thank you for watching Kalimah Hurra. I've been George Galloway, and you have been a marvelous audience.